Let's look at two cheap motors that have come out for the mini touring cars in the UK for 2020. They're cost-reduced motors, retailing about half the price of top range spec motors. And there's two here. One is from Zombie, and one is called the Rage. They come in these sort of identical boxes, possibly made at the same place, and we'll have a look at them, measure the spec, and just see how they compare perhaps to the more expensive ones. A quick look at them. Let's go. The Zombie is called the MTZ Club 175T Clubman UK stock spec 17.5, and the Rage is called the Rage Clubman 540-V3 brushless motor 17.5 turns spec. Now, I know by looking at this one in particular, it'll be made by Surpass. I'm not sure where this one is made. Anyway, we'll do all the measurements on them, but briefly just looking at them first. They're both a nice black colour. They've got, the Zombie in particular has got good cooling holes. The Rage, not so many holes. And you can see lots of construction, how they've been made inside, just by looking at the outside here. And there's good and bad points. And one good thing I would say is that Surpass make a lot of motors for a lot of people, and generally even in their cheap ones they use some of the latest parts. It's cheaper for them to use production line parts than try and keep manufacturing old parts. So you often find that although the case might be old-fashioned looking, inside the most important part, the stator and windings, is normally the latest spec. Parts that may not be the latest spec are the collector ring on the front, where they can solder on a cheap one that they've probably got lots of, and rather than the big silver plated ones you see on their expensive motors. Same with the Zombie. They're probably using the latest stator off the production line, but using some cheaper parts. You probably find that the sensor boards are the same as using the expensive ones. And you can also tell from that this is a Surpass. They're using the aluminium screws that appeared on their motors from about V4 onwards. Now they call this the V3. So Surpass have had V3s, V4s, and now V5s. So they're working on one of the older type of specs. They didn't want to compete with their latest V5. They both look pretty good. The Zombie in particular is nice. They've both got white legend writing all over them. Single sensor ports on this one, and dual sensor port on the Rage, just like they have on all the Surpass motors. So again, they've just adopted the existing tooling for the M-Bell and save money. So that's still the latest. Nice big legends on this one compared to some motors where you can actually read the degrees of timing. Same on the Zombie, it's pretty clear, which is actually better than some of the expensive motors where you can't actually hardly read the legend. I think on the expensive Surpass V5s, for instance, very difficult to read. 3 screws hold the sensor board on both. The Zombie has steel screws, but they look like the small diameter to try and keep any interference effect to the magnetic field to the minimum, but they do go all the way through, as do these. And on the latest expensive motors you'll get in, except for the Surpass, the M-Bell, the whole motor tend to be screwed together just by little screws in the end and no screws going through anymore. So that way they're still older design. These are typical Surpass heavy duty connections. These have got the vertical connections. They look very heavy duty as well, in fact impressively heavy duty. Some of these are easier to solder on than these. I always find these more difficult to get the wires in properly, but at least they're a decent size. Shimming is good on both, hardly any play. You can see the bearings, the cutouts on the front, and there's cutouts on the back of that as well. The shaft protrusion, which can be a problem on some cars if it's very close to the batteries, it can hit it and fit in the pinion, etc. You want to see how far it comes from the actual mounting face. Mounting face on the Zombie is flush. On the Rage, it's got a raised piece in the middle, so missing that out. Zombie one is shorter. It's quite a gap on the length of the Rage one's longer, and I did measure them as well from the face using this, and I've written that down as well. And the flat for your pinion goes pretty much down quite close to the end, which is good. They both got codes written on. The Rage has C74125 and the Zombie has M-TZ-50123, implying that the rotor diameter is only 12.3 millimeter diameter, and this will be 12.5. They're not stock spec motors. They're called stock specs, but they're not the legal ones for racing in the blinky class. So therefore, we wouldn't perhaps expect the rotors to comply. And in fact, the 12.3 wouldn't comply. So it'd be interesting to measure them when they're out. Just feeling the strength. They're similar, but they're not very, very strong like you find on modern motors, expensive motors, and you can see the magnets aren't that strong because you can spin this quite easy. I haven't got one here, but on the latest top of the range motors, it probably only does one revolution and stops dead, and this one stops a bit quicker than that one, definitely, but doesn't necessarily mean that it will be better or worse. You can test the winding resistances like normal, test the kV, take the magnet rotors out, measure them as well. So we got onto that, but first, the easiest thing you can do first off is measure the weight. Now, some of the motors that we've seen up to now, and I've got a chart here, have some very lightweight motors. The Hobbywing G3R is way down, 136.8 grams. Only SMC has come close to that. Others tend to be about 145 for the Phantom Icon. That's made by Surpass. Surpass's own V5R, 148.5 grams. And some of the other motors, Trinity X Factor, 145. So these being slightly cost reduced, you probably wouldn't find they would be as light. Let's test the Rage, 156.5. So it's a little heavier, maybe 10 grams on some of the cheaper ones, some of the top of the range ones, and the Zombie, 153.1. So it's slightly lighter. That's partly due, I would say, to the rotor being smaller diameter. That'd be less weight, and it also has more cutouts, saving a little weight. The length of the motors, also interestingly, the Zombie is shorter, noticeably shorter at the end bell end. The end bell tends to stick out a bit on there, so that's another plus if you want to get the weight in on your car. You don't want it hanging out. The all-important winding resistance, I said earlier that I expected them to use the latest stators and winding techniques, so we expect the resistance to be pretty low. Perhaps they're not using the latest collectors on the front, which might put up the resistance a tiny bit. So first of all, zero this very accurate low ohm resistance meter, just check it's near enough to zero, and we can compare to some of the winding resistances that we had previously. 0.037 is pretty much normal on the top of the range motors. So all we do now is check out one of the phases. Okay, checking the Rage Clubman, 0.036. Very low winding resistance, lower than some of the top of the range ones on that pole. Let's try and check another pole. They should all basically come out near enough the same. 0.036, and the third pole 0.037. So that's particularly very good. So there's no problem with the windings on these at all. They're top of the range. Let's try the zombie one now. 0.037, another pole 0.038, and the third connection 0.038. I'd say 0.038 on the zombie, which isn't quite as good, but it's very close enough. So winding resistance is the Rage slightly ahead of the zombie, but they're close enough to exist in the highest performing motors that I've tested. Checking the all-important kV so I can compare them directly. I'll set them to near enough 6 amps for the comparison, which is a good starting place if you were doing blinky or no ESC time in racing. I'm not going to waste too much time. I've got 6.1 amps, giving you kV of 3175, which is quite a bit down on top of the range, but it doesn't mean that it won't be any good, because we'll check out the rotor strength and everything in a minute. Now to check the timing, we'll check the timing of the sensor board and then check the M bell to see how it compares. Okay, the timing, it says it's only down at 43 degrees and the sensor spread is good, 45, 42, 43. Checking the M bell, it goes 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, which is good. Some of the M bell of other manufacturers are not clear and don't go in easy steps like that. And it's set just below 50, I'd say about 48. The reading that we got was 43, which would be lower down, set down there. Anyway, so the M bell isn't spot on according to the meter. Testing the kV on the Rage. Same amps as the Zombie, 6.1. Got a much higher kV. That could be down to the weaker rotor. We'll check that in a minute. 45 degrees and the spread. It's not as close as the Zombie, 4 degrees out, but that's okay. I mean, 4 degrees is not a disaster. On this motor it's marked 0, 20, 40, 60, and you can see it's about halfway between 40 and 60, which is close to 50. It said 45 on the tester, so again the M bell and the marking doesn't totally coincide with this, though on the top of the range motors I found that the M bell timing and this can be very close. I've taken the two motors apart to have a look at the inside and measure the rotor strength, etc. So now we can see side by side the construction is very much different, the way that the whole cans are put together, etc. This is typical of, you see, of surpass can. The stator is forced in so that it doesn't rattle about, so you can't really take it out. And this is the type with the longer part for the M bell goes on, and then the front part goes on, the machined aluminium part. It's got the sensor board in there, which is typical, and a small insulation. And on the Zombie one, it actually says Zombie 2018, and this is a longer, the can is much longer because it just uses a typical front aluminium, and the back part is much shorter. And as I showed earlier, the whole motor is a bit shorter. Again, an inch, just a safety insulation part. just to stop these shorting out on anything when you solder them up. The screws on the, as I said, on the surpass are not magnetic. The ones, or those quite small diameter, are magnetic. There's just steel. The sensor board. Sensor boards tend to be, I don't know if they're all made at the same place anymore, but there's not much to see really. It's got the 3 sensors. And the way that they're held, they try and hold them vertically so that they're not skewed about when they're assembled. They've got an aluminium collar, and this has got a collar as well, which is all good. Looking at these just briefly side by side, you can see that the current flows to the windings. They're soldered down here, here, and here, and riveted up top to stop these moving around, which you get on some motors, and they can, with very small gaps, you don't want them touching. Inside you might not be able to see, but I can. The windings, pretty neat on both. You can see them very easily on the Rage. But just looking at the construction inside of the stator themselves, there are gaps we've seen on different motors. The gap between the 3 stator segments can vary in how wide or narrow that is. And they're slightly different on these. The Zombie one is definitely wider. You can't see it, but I can just by the eye. Than the gap on the Surpass one. The other important part for the stator is the thickness of the leg. Very hard to see because it's got windings around it. I did show in earlier videos all about that. The thickness of the legs, even the thickness of this part here, and the gap between them, between the metal parts. So they're not the same stators, they are made slightly differently. In the front you can see with the collector where the 3 wires are joined. Latest ones, like on this one here, got this massive silver plated collector with very low resistance. A lot of the top range motors use that now, and the older motors tend to use this cheaper, thinner, stamped out sort of brass. I don't know what it's made of, but they're both very similar and soldered up. They've both got insulations behind them, black and red here, just to stop them shorting on the windings. But it also can block a little bit of air that would try and flow through the slots, get stopped. It doesn't need to be that wide. But they do it like that. Measuring the important stator length, I should imagine they're using production ones. They're not going to make undersized ones. The rule is not below 19.30 measured across the metal parts. You've got the exposed metal end of the stator there. You don't measure on the insulation, which is the green part. Now, this one is fairly difficult. It's exposed just on that edge. Then you've got to find another bit in a little window. About 19.5, 19.6. You will find it varies as you go round. On this one it's got 17.5 turn marked on the stator there, and also notice the stator is being blacked over. I don't know if they've done that all the way around or just in that window. When they're exposed, the silver stators, they tend to go rusty after a while and look horrible. And some manufacturers have taken to blacken them on over to make them look nicer. 19.38 is quite narrow just there, but it's just above the minimum, 19.30. The Zombie stator length is a bit easier to measure it. 8.5. It's probably got an additional lamination compared to the Surpass, 19.91. That probably accounts for the fractionally high winding resistance. They've probably got very slightly longer wire. Having a look at the rotors, this is the Rage rotor. It's got a lot of writing on it, 12.5 by 7.2 by 25.5, and it's a stock spec design, so it's got a large center part, non-magnetic, and then the magnetic part's wrapped round, a black end with balancing. We can double check the size, about 12.45, and the magnetic length, you can get long ones as well. Longer's been better, it does increase the weight. Magnetic length about 25.5, and you can see the code on the end, C74125. Checking the Zombie rotor, it just says Zombie engraved on it, and the code M-TZ-50123, and we can measure the size. Let's see if it's a 12.3. I'm measuring about 12.22, and the magnetic length about 24.5. It's this way these rotors have got something that keeps it away from the scale so the magnet won't affect it. This is the Zombie one, 25.6 grams. Weight of the Rage, 27.3. A couple of grams in it because the other one is smaller. Now the rotor strength. This is the one from the Rage. Got a minus 1479 and a plus 1480, so very accurate, but not that strong. The top of the range motors we're getting now, they're normally around 1600 Gauss is what people have been wanting and getting. So these are still quite weak. And now we have the Zombie one, which is smaller diameter, but construction's different. This is like a mod motor one. It doesn't have the large non-magnetic center part. And that's, you see with that design, and the non-magnetic with the non-magnetic part not in the middle, so more magnet available. You get a minus 1648 and a 1629. So quite a strong rotor, which will be good. And being lighter weight, it'll spin up quicker. So the way that these motors are going to operate will be quite different to each other. The Rage has got a much weaker rotor, and that will give you a higher kV, which it has done when we tested it. And the Zombie, much stronger rotor, and it gave lower kV. On the modern, the latest high spec, expensive motors, they've managed to get high kV and high rotor strength, but these are slightly older designs that haven't achieved it. But the Zombie has got a much stronger rotor, which will give it a really good bottom end. So conclusions, which one, or will they be the same on the track? Actually, they've come out a bit different, and I'm sure they may perform differently for different people on different tracks. They're not going to be identical. Why? Well, let's look at the results. And the main difference that's going to make the biggest difference, is the rotor strength. The Zombie is using what we call a modified rotor, as these aren't stock spec. You can use any rotor, and they've used a high Gauss one. I measured it 1629 minus 1648, so pretty strong. It's a smaller diameter though. I only measured 12.22. They say it's 12.3, I believe. And it's standard's fairly short back to front. It's not one of the long ones. But it means it'll spin up well, and it will have good torque, even though it doesn't feel like it when you actually turn it over. Compared to the Rage Clubman, that's got a standard like stock spec rotor, but a fairly old specified one, which the rotor strength is quite low compared to what we want these days. 1480, whereas Phantom Icon, you see, is 1570, and we go right up to the Trinity, which is around 1600, and a lot of the other motors now are running stronger rotors. I mean, I haven't always measured them, so they must vary out of the factory. I don't know. As long as they meet the physical dimensions, the rotor strength is never specified. And I've measured some quite low ones, but I'm told they're pretty high now. For instance, on the Hobbywing D3R, I measured low, but I'm told they're really strong now, so I don't know what's coming out of the factory, since the ones I measured, the same with the Orca, was very low, the one I measured, and I'm told now that they're so strong you can hardly turn them over. So I don't know what's going on at the factory there. Anyway, as I said, on these two, rotor strength is going to make a big difference, because the Zombie is strong, which resulted in low kV, very low really, 3175 compared to these 3400 over 3.4 and the Trinity over 3.4. So pretty low, but with the extra torque, you can gear it up. Also, on the Rage, equivalent sort of kV as these others, but with the weak rotor, it's not going to have the torque, and you'll have to gear them differently, I would say, on the track. You'll have to gear this with a smaller pinion. Also, tuning them, I tune them 6.1 amps. A lot of people find that they can tune higher, and possibly with the Zombie you can turn it up, and perhaps to 9 amps. I know some people have gone even higher to get the kV and utilize the torque as well. It probably wouldn't be a good idea to do that with the Rage. You could if you turn the amps up, the revs would go up, but you won't have the strength in the rotor, and it'll probably overheat. It did have the best winding, 0.036 compared to 0.38, and that's probably due to the fact that the stator was, I think, about one lamination smaller, but still within the rules. I don't think there are any rules for this motor, but it's within this is more like a proper stock spec motor that would meet the rules, where the Zombie, if it had a stock spec rotor, it'd probably be more expensive, because to get a high stock spec Gauss rotor probably cost at the factory a lot more money. What else to say about them? Well, the weight's still low compared to what they were a year or two ago. Not as low as the 140 odd grams we're getting on the expensive motors, but not bad. Anything else to say? Well, I found the timing on the M-bell was out. If you try and set it just by looking at the readings, if you set it just at 48 or 50, actually on the M-bell, it would probably be fairly close on the Zombie, but on this one, if you put 50 on the M-bell, the current, I reckon, would be too high. So that's a conclusion. Money, I believe they're about half the price of some of the top of the range motors they're used in the mini touring cars. Both will work well, I think, but you will have to gear them differently.